Okay, so we've had sort of a brief discussion of these institutional approaches to defining rural, but it gets more complicated because rural also has these very strong symbolic meanings as well. And with this, we move away from the way that bureaucrats and policymakers think about rural to the way that rural people themselves think about where they live and what that means to them and who they are, but also the images that non-rural people have of rural America. So that is, places are not only rural because of particular structural or demographic or environmental characteristics, but because the people who live there think of themselves as being rural with respect to a set of social, moral, and cultural values. So Mike Arnold, who was a longtime figure in the rural education research world, he once said that when you lock your car on Sundays at church to keep the neighbors from putting zucchinis on the seat, you know you're probably in a rural place. And I've heard other people talk about rural in terms of distance, the distance one has to drive to get to a Walmart or a McDonald's restaurant or even a Starbucks. And it's interesting because it turns out that while approximately 82% of the U.S. population lives within a census-defined urbanized area, approximately the same proportion of the population lives within 20 miles of a Starbucks. So, more to the point, a few years ago I traveled around to different rural communities conducting focus groups as part of a larger study, and I frequently heard comments like the following. So this one person says, a lot of times I think this type of community is somewhat bred into these kids. And I'm just speaking from experience in that you want to sometimes come back to where your roots were and raise your kids how you were raised. So even though they want to get away and go to college or wherever, I think long term some of those kids usually end up back in this community or another one like it, like in my case. And then the second person says, I was telling this teacher yesterday, I didn't see it myself, my daughter shared it with me, but my middle son, there's this new thing on Facebook, 25 random things about me. I don't know if you've heard about this or not. Anyway, one of the facts that my middle son put down was that he was raised on dirt roads, and that's where he wants to raise his kids. So there are these strong positive symbolic associations with rural and rurality, linking it to family and community and neighborliness, closeness to nature, self-reliance. But at the same time, it's also important to acknowledge the equally persistent negative stereotypes of rural as backwards, pre-modern, or even anti-modern, stereotypes that also affect how rural people see themselves and how other people view them. I'll never forget coming to Penn State and starting to work with PARS, which was the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools. And I went to a PARS board meeting, which was made up of rural superintendents, because I had this idea that maybe in the educational leadership program where I'm based, we might be able to work with PARS to develop a rural administration certificate, a series of courses that would provide a certificate to rural administrators. And so I was kind of floating a trial balloon with these guys, and as I was doing it, I was looking around the room, and the faces were just they were very neutral, and I finished up and I said, well, what do you think? And one of the guys said, well, to tell you the truth, we appreciate the idea, but it wouldn't really help us, and in fact it would probably hurt us more than anything else, because we're already stereotyped as rural superintendents and not able to handle the administrative challenges of a larger school district, which to me was kind of dumbfounding based on what I knew about the challenges and the multitasking and the kinds of skill sets that are needed by rural educators and rural administrators. And yet, there was this specter of these negative rural stereotypes rearing their heads.